Okay, so I think this is us. Let's welcome everybody. And we're here exploring and discussing Pathwork Guide Lecture number 180. And it was channeled March 1970. And the title is The Spiritual Significance of Human Relationship. Did you raise your hand, Judy?
No, that was an accident. I'm sorry.
Feel free to just speak. Yeah, and I'm realizing as I'm launching into this that there's something I'm really kind of excited about a little bit that I've been meaning to share, and it's not exactly about this lecture, but it seems that there is another woman that's in France who is channeling material that's very similar to the Pathwork Guide lectures, and so we're actually going to have a session with her, some of the map people, and just kind of explore that. But I've also been just looking, there's a couple that are translated into English on the website that you can read, and one of them was sort of for Easter time last year, and was sort of addressing some of COVID and just interesting things. So I think it's up for everybody to decide how they want to categorize that, but the type of material that's being offered seems familiar, and seems like hopefully maybe there can be a additional information coming in. So I'll keep you posted.
I tuned into one of her channelings last
year. Did you?
Yeah.
What did you think?
To be honest with you, it was a long time ago, and I don't remember, but I do remember tuning in, and actually it wasn't in French, it was in English.
She channeled it in English. Interesting. Yeah. So
yeah. Who is this person, and how do you find her?
Marianne, I always think of, I always get her last name.
Hubert. Marianne Hubert.
Yeah, there you go.
How do you spell it, Frank?
I think it's H-U-B-E-R-T. I think it's like Hubert or something like that in French, or something. I don't know, something like that. I will send a link out to our group, with her website.
Have you ever heard of Paul Selig? Does anybody know Paul Selig?
I have heard of him mostly through you.
Yeah.
It seems like the name is familiar, but I don't think I'm familiar with particularly any of the channeling. So would happy to be, if you want to send a good one or, recommend.
Yeah. He channels a group called The Guides, pluralized. But it's usually just one voice.
Right. I think that's essentially what the guide is as well as, and I think the guide says that, it's a group of beings that are all working together to make the transmissions come through.
The material is similar. The difference is that it's so funny because Paul himself is one of the students of the guides. And so the guides say, as they're channeling through him, will often say, Paul's interrupting again with a question, and then they respond to Paul's question. Right. And Paul, they kind of make fun of Paul as they're channeling. So Eva's lectures are so crisp and concise and well spoken. So I don't know how edited they were. Like in Paul's books, they don't really
right.
go through how it is in the live session.
There's a lot of editing. If you listen to one of Eva's original recordings, you'll know that there's a lot of editing.
Okay, I should do that. I'm going to go back and do that.
Yeah. And there's this interesting astrologer that I find is, like, her name is Tanya Gabriel, and she calls herself a wealth astrologer, and she's also like into numerology, and so usually I would not, that would not be, but the way she describes both the astrological and the numerological things, it's like she's basically talking about the same things it says in the lecture. So she's the most pathwork oriented astrologer I've ever run across, kind of talking about the different, aspects of the medicine wheel of the astrology as we go around. So I kind of enjoy her things and as well. So So anyway, there's lots of great stuff out there, and we're exploring and learning, and more people are kind of downloading, I think, all of this truth right into these times. And sort of, to me, Eva and the guy, like they came in sort of right in that early cusp of this awakening, right? And at the same time, there were other things happening in other channels and other spiritual awakenings. But it does feel like it's a, as the guide said, a transmission of light and information that is kind of universally coming in through many channels. um, and all of them are here trying to help ground and anchor these truths and teachings so that we can find our way back into some balance and stuff. So in this lecture, I thought was like, I mean, it's one that's probably familiar to many people, but I just always find that it's important to kind of re-engrave or re-imprint or remember these things. And so I find the whole understanding of relationship with the path work is a very powerful one. So let's go ahead and learn from the guide about the spiritual significance of human relationship. So he says, greetings, my dearest friends, blessings for every one of you. Blessed be your very life, your every breath, your thoughts, and your feelings. This lecture deals with relationships and their tremendous significance from the spiritual point of view, which is that of individual growth and unification. First, I would like to point out that on the human level of manifestation, individual units of consciousness do not exist, which sometimes harmonize, but very often conflict with one another, creating friction and crisis.
He says they do exist.
Yeah, excuse me. I was thinking that's not making sense. So let me try that again. First, I would like to point out that on the human level of manifestation, individual units of consciousness do exist, which sometimes harmonize, but very often conflict with one another, creating friction and crisis. This is the interesting thing, though. Beyond this level of manifestation, there are no other fragmented units of consciousness. Above the human level, there is only one consciousness through which every single created entity is expressed differently. When one comes into one's own and experiences this truth, one without losing, we do that without losing a sense of individuality. So it's an interesting thing, and I find it almost, every time I read that, it reminds me, like when I look into, the eyes of the deer outside in my backyard, or, the squirrels that I'm always chasing off of my bird feeder, or, the different birds and stuff, like it's almost like I get that sense that every one of them is equally present and conscious, and it's like God, it's that one consciousness, and I understand that maybe, the animal level or something is somewhat below the human level in this kind of way of hierarchy, but I think at some level, really, we all are participating in this one consciousness. And then, within us, we have all of these fragmented and conflicting things. That was one of the things that was in that new lecture that Marianne was talking about, the cross and how that represented these conflicts, within us, and the dualities and the splits within us. And so, when we're, working with all of this, we're the fragmented consciousness, and we're, working to try to reunify that within our own experience. So I realized I didn't check in with anybody or see if anybody wanted to say anything, in the beginning, or have any comments if you had a chance to read this or anything. So let's open if anybody does.
Yeah, I'd like to say something. There are a number of things that came up for me around it, but I really like the reminder that through relationships, we're able to evoke the parts that we need to work on, basically. We're able to kind of exaggerate and nudge and tease out these distortions and these issues. And it really came at the right time, actually. Over the weekend, I was doing some work with you, Darlene, and about trust and just trusting others. And then today I found out that, a close acquaintance of mine has broken some really deep trust about confidentiality. And it was just really interesting how that played out. How, through that experience, I got to feel my old fears come up. And since they were already kind of on the surface, I was already exploring them. They didn't take over in the same kind of way. And I was able to see that, there wasn't actually that much issue that was created from it. And so, I don't know, without getting too more deeply into my own personal experience with it, I just found that really fascinating that all of this kind of happened in a very synchronistic kind of way. The lecture, the own process, and then this event,
very interesting.
Interesting.
Yeah. No, I think, and I find it often is that way, that there, in our own individual journeys, there are these kinds of synchronicities and these kinds of ways that, things, and like you said, beautiful. I mean, if we can really recognize that, what appears to be the interpersonal conflicts that, we have in relationship are really, there, to evoke these places inside of us. And then we can see that and do that work around it, right? It's like, it really does make a very different story and experience out of, working through these things. And usually then also there's a deeper intimacy and harmony that really can be established, especially, with, people that are closer, couples or whatever. So, but yeah, sounds great. And we just get kind of lost always in, the pain body place, which, from the childhood place, it was, we were trapped in it, and we couldn't, we wanted to change that, right, somehow. So we tried to figure out how to do that. So let's go ahead with the lecture. And does anybody else want to chime in general? So let's go ahead and he says, when one comes into one's own, we experience this truth of, one single, consciousness, but we don't lose a sense of our own unique individuality, right? And then he says that this can be felt distinctly when you deal with your own inner disharmonies. So there's also the same exact principle as applied, right? So he says, in your present state, a part of your innermost being is developed and governs your thinking, feeling, willing, and acting. And there are other parts still in a lower state of development, which also govern and influence your thinking, feeling, willing, and acting. And thus you find yourself divided. And this always creates tension, pain, and anxiety, as well as inner and outer difficulties. So it's like, we're always looking for that cross, that dividedness within us whenever we're suffering in some way and in pain. And it's really powerful to do that, and within, rather than what often we unconsciously do from this lower state of development, which is kind of feel like it's something that we're a victim of, that somebody else is imposing on us in some way. So some aspect of your personality are in truth, and others in error and distortion. and the resulting confusion causes grave disturbances. What you usually do is push one side out of the way and identify with the other. And yet this denial of a part of you cannot bring unification. On the contrary, it widens the split. So what must be done is to bring out the deviating, conflicting side and face it. Face the entire ambivalence. Only when you do find the ultimate reality of your unified self, only then do you find the ultimate reality of your unified self. And as you know, unification and peace emerge to the degree you recognize, accept, and understand the nature of the inner conflict. So, I think that this is really beautiful here, right? And where we can, keep working with finding the truth. Oftentimes it's not even, like there's truth on one side and distortion on the other, but it's like there's divinity and distortion in the way that we're understanding it, in the way that we're holding it on both sides, right? So I find it really useful to work this kind of split concept, right? To just in the inner searching always ask, what is the truth? And in that we're looking at where we find that we've got two opposing voices, or maybe even many voices all saying different things, but to take them one by one, right? And in each voice, listen and ask yourself, what is the divinity? What is the piece of God, the truth, the thing that I want to keep in this? And what is the distortion? Where is it tempting me into pride, self-will, and fear? Where is it overgeneralizing? Where is it not connecting to the divine in some way, right? And just is in resistance, is in negativity, is in defense, that kind of thing. So where we find that, then we know, there's, it's like lost. It's a piece of consciousness that's lost and confused. And so we have to help it bring back the truth. And when we try to, just see it and say, oh, that's the bad me, or that's the weak me, or that's the, the messed up me, or the too aggressive me, the too much me, and we reject and we fight against, we judge ourselves, and this is a kind of an attempt at denial, right, of some part of us. And that's what the guide is saying here is that that's the opposite direction that we really need to go. It does not bring the unification. We have to somehow be with all of these aspects. And so he says exactly the same law applies to the unity of dissension now between outwardly separate and different entities. So if we can understand how, the inner conflict happens within us, then we can also kind of like realize that, oftentimes the person we're in conflict with is actually representing one of our inner entities, right? We're actually projecting. There's a kind of, way that we're identified with one side and they're speaking for the voice of the shadow within us. And that often, is bringing out for us to see more clearly our own internal conflict. So it helps to, sort of explore, when we feel like we're in a conflict with somebody else, like how they might, be representing some aspect of ourself as well. Says dissension is caused not by actual differences among units of consciousness, but just as in the individual by differences in the development of the manifesting universal consciousness. And so again, it's like, no, we're not bad, or good. We're like at different stages of development, right? Different levels of capacity of evolution. And so it says, even though the principle of unification is exactly the same within and among individuals, it can't be applied to another human being unless it has first been applied to one's inner self. So if the divergent parts of yourself are not approached according to this truth, and your ambivalence is not faced, accepted, and understood, then the process of unification cannot be put into practice with another person. This is a very important fact, which explains the great emphasis of this pathwork on first approaching the self. Only then can relationship be cultivated in a meaningful and effective way. So, even in the leadership bodies in the pathwork, we're sort of working to codify this, right, in ritual and in process, even among us, right, where if we have conflict, it's like the law of brotherhood says, we don't ignore that conflict, but on the other hand, if we haven't worked it inside of ourselves, if we're triggered by something in another person, and the first thing that we really have the responsibility to do is take it to our helper and look at what's getting activated and what's inside of us first. And then if there's still an issue, right, then we can usually without charge try to communicate it. And if that fails, then we also have kind of a community way of looking at it, and assuming that somehow it's a larger community issue, right? So and this is very important and beautiful. And I don't know, if there's a way that we can, expand this way of like working with each other in community, in our groups and our relationships in general. But I feel like this is kind of a beautiful, thing that the guide is offering here that I would like to see shared in the world more, brought out into the world more. So he says, I shall now try to outline some elements of dissension and unification between human beings in a relationship and show how these parallel the individual process. I should like to say that relationship represents the greatest challenge for the individual, for it is only in relationship to others that the unresolved problems still existing within the individual psyche are affected and activated. So this is why I always call these problematic relationships or periods in relationship, it's like we're working with the good enemy, right? It's like it's somebody that we hate because they're triggering us, but they're really like a gift, right? And we want to appreciate, even though at the same time we may be unhappy with the fact that we're being activated in this way. But if we can hold both, like allow the activation to let it move without completely identifying and really recognize, the gift that this is for us, then that becomes a very powerful cauldron of transformation for this work. He says this is why many individuals withdraw from interaction with each other, right? As the unresolved things, you get activated and you don't know what to do with them, right? And if they just continue to create painful interaction, it's probably the best thing you can do in some ways is, to let go. And, sometimes in families, you just kind of keep trying to fix it and it just keeps making it worse, so there's lots of different ways we can get stuck and not find sort of the way through. But Harry's saying if we can really do this inner work and own our own parts, that really can make the huge difference. So he says the illusion can sometimes be maintained that problems arise from the other person when one feels disturbance only in his or her presence and not when by oneself, right? So like when we're alone, nothing, we're happy, it's only when we're having to be in relationship that it gets to be a little more difficult. And I think it's true for all of us in various ways that we're kind of trying to learn how to be with each other again on all kinds of levels of relationship, and how to be honest and not get not be submissive and not be overly aggressive, like how do we dance together? How do we have, working relationships and deep intimate relationships, and I don't know, I think sometimes maybe in earlier times in tribal or extended family things, we had some things of value, but then maybe it was too enmeshed and maybe it was too controlling, right? And so we had to sort of become very independent and separated and only have, one or two people maybe that we really are close to and that we want to be around, and for the most part, and everybody else we kind of like to say hi to every once in a while or whatever, so there's, this kind of thing of how do we not only unify within ourselves, but, embrace all of our brothers and sisters. And I know some people that live in India and they talk about how, like crowded and how, the humanity of this kind of thing is just right there, right? And there's a whole different way of responding and how different it is than here. So it's just something interesting, I think, that this is also pointing to in some way. And we're trying to, find a new level of our own maturity, in working with the feelings that relationship bring up inside of us. So being alone elicits the inner call for contact, right? And then the less the contact is cultivated, the more the longing becomes. And then that's a different kind of pain, a pain of loneliness and frustration. So when we, feel like, other people trigger our stuff and then we have to run from it, then, that works a little bit, but it's kind of like it's that split again, it's like there's a damned if I do, damned if I don't, a death, right? So if I am out of the frustrating conflict or I'm out of the, challenging, conflict with somebody else, that feels better in some ways, but then it's alone, right? And then the aloneness becomes the death on that side, and it eventually drives us back into contact. But because we have the image and we believe the contact is not going to be fulfilling and, all of that, and because we also need to, have the contact bring up our inner, distortions and images, then, we go back in and the contact seems painful and we blame the circumstance or the person and, run away again. So, part of, I think, the container that we do in our Pathwork groups is to try to just, hold a space where people can feel those things, right? But not totally have to act on them, right? And hang out and, test and see if they can, see if something else might not happen if they don't, react in this kind of split that just bounces them back and forth between two different kinds of suffering. So he says, contact makes it difficult to maintain the illusion for long that the inner self is faultless and harmonious, right? So it requires mental aberration to claim for too long that problems in relationship are caused only by others and not by oneself. This is why relationships are simultaneously a fulfillment, a challenge, and a gauge to one's inner state. So like they're mirrors for us, right? And then they're also, challenges to grow, reflecting where our cutting edges, where the places that we have to question and open to. So, and they're reflecting sort of our images, our belief structures, right? So it's really good to see, what the beliefs are that come in the frictions that arise in relating. He says the friction that arises out of relating with others can be a sharp instrument of purification and self-recognition if one is inclined to use it. So by withdrawing from this challenge and sacrificing the fulfillment of intimate contact, many inner problems are never called into play. The illusion of inner peace and unity that comes from avoidance of relating has even led to concepts that spiritual growth is being furthered by isolation. So, some of the monastery, or the, priestly kind of isolation, you have to be not in contact. And the guy that's saying, that's not at all like his understanding of it. So nothing could be further from the truth. This statement must not be confused with the notion that intervals of seclusion are necessary for inner concentration and self-confrontation, but the period should always alternate with contact. And the more intimate such contact is, the more it expresses spiritual maturity. Contact and lack of contact with others can be observed in various stages. And there are many degrees of contact between the crass extremes of total outer and inner isolation at one end and the deepest, most intimate relatedness at the other, such as a capacity to love and accept others, to deal with the mutually arising problems, to find balance between self-assertion and giving in, to give and receive, and to be acutely aware of the interacting levels. So does anybody want to comment here? I mean, I've said a lot, and this is good stuff, right? How is it landing? Anybody have any thoughts about it?
It's clear this lecture is really, for me, one of the few ones that really specifies this is what you need to do. This is how it feels when you don't do it. This is why you should do it. So I've got it. Thank you so far. Anyway, I'm sure I'll have lots of questions later. Okay,
great.
I might comment on my personal behavior. I'm one of those guys who needs to go back to his cave to recharge a lot.
Yeah.
Particularly when I find myself around people whose behavior is chaotic. That will really get me back to my cave in quick order. So, I mean, and sometimes, and my roommate and I were actually having this discussion last night about how difficult it is to find your tribe, so to speak. Which for me was what sort of like what Pathwork was all about. It was like, wow, I found some like-minded people who can actually hang in an intimate relationship, in an intimate manner, and not spew a whole lot of chaos all over the place. But, just one of my personal things. It's like, I do need a lot of time to recharge in my cave.
Yeah, and I think, I think there is a real thing that is introversion that does need that, and also, there's a lot, we don't even realize how much the chaos in the world is kind of bombarding us, I think, so there's, I think, even, a greater need in some ways. And it's kind of like, how do we find the right balance? How do we, sort of maybe challenge, like you said, chaos is the feeling that you can't stand. And, so, it's not like you want to put yourself through a, continuous chaotic thing, but sort of sometimes when we find ourselves, the universe brings that kind of exposure to us, right? That we can kind of work to be curious, like, well, what is it about chaos that I can't stand, right? What happens, and how.
I can't even watch a movie where the character is like a calamity. Some movies the main character is a total calamity. I'm like, that's enough. 4 minutes of that's enough.
There must be a difference for you. I see sometimes nature, is like not all neat and, like organized, or, like there's a kind of chaos and natural chaos, right? That seems okay for you. It's just sort of human calamity or human craziness or something. So, but it's kind of like it usually goes back to the image, right? Or back to the childhood wound, right? In some ways, right? Like like even when we understand our defense mechanisms, one of the studies in the keys talks about like, so, if you're a reason type, your worst death is, like to be rejected. And if you're, a will type, maybe your worst experience is chaos, right? So there's different ones. I forget exactly how they are, but it's kind of like there are these fundamental deaths, and chaos and lack of control, is definitely up there for many people to be, but if you think about it, what control do we really have? And
The only control I have is to get back to my cave.
right. And how do we learn to surrender sometimes when we can't, because like if we just contract against the chaos, like if like if you're going to have to go through chaos, it's better to kind of learn maybe how to relax in the midst of it, right? And expand and hold a space for it somehow, right? And when we can hold ourselves that way, it helps the suffering. It helps us, not be so, like the guide says, we contract against the contraction, right? And that's where the suffering happens. So if we can relax into the contraction or into the, scary or the chaos or the, negative feeling in some way, that can help us, let it move through, and it doesn't get stuck in us, and we don't get so tangled up in it. And it's much less painful overall. It may have, some challenging moments, but it won't create suffering. So,
Darlene, you said something about how different triggers basically affect different types more. Is that from one of the lectures? Do you recall where that might be?
Yeah, I think you might look under the reason, will, and emotion lecture. The one on reason, will, and emotion, I think, is where it talks about it.
Awesome, thank you.
So he's saying, there are like, this potential, right, of intimacy, of contact, of relatedness, and kind of this flow of giving in, of receiving and giving, of being self-assertive, and all of that. It's like there is a balance and a natural harmony and a dance in intimate relatedness, right? And so it's possible, he says, to measure one's personal sense of fulfillment by the depth of relatedness and intimate contact, by the strength of the feelings one permits oneself to experience, and by the willingness to give and receive. Frustration indicates an absence of contact, which in turn is a precise indicator that the self withdraws from the challenge of relationship, sacrificing personal fulfillment, pleasure, love, and joy. And when you want to share only on the basis of receiving according to your own terms, and this is why I find, like a lot of people that are in relationships and have couples issues and struggle with, relationship dynamics, right? There's this kind of, they have this idea of what this relationship is supposed to be like, right? And so then they try to mold the person into that idea of their relationship, and they're not really relating to the person. They're just wanting the person to give them a particular experience or a certain, image of a relationship. So it says, when we want to share only on the basis of receiving according to our own terms, and we're unwilling secretly to share, right, then the longings must remain unfulfilled. And he says, one's contentment and fulfillment in relationship is a much neglected yardstick for one's own development. So we can kind of also, in general, look at, that, and, the deeper relationships we have, usually, like we have a certain, they call it emotional intelligence, right? A certain level of maturity within us that can do this give and take. And you know, open to share in a relationship, listening. I often find that, in tug of wars, with, trying to get the other side, people are more attached to trying to get their needs, and they're not really listening to the other person, right? And so it kind of takes this willingness to listen, not necessarily to who's right or who's wrong or anything like that, but just what's the real need here, and whose need is the greatest, and who can be in service in this moment, and maybe it's not for anybody to, and the person needs to just be in their need as well, but there's a kind of way that we can deeply listen and work that through, rather than just doing it from sort of the power struggle and trying to make the other person, show up in this way that we think we need. So he says relationships with others is a mirror of one's own state and thus a direct help to one's self-purification. Conversely, only by thorough self-honesty and self-facing can relationships be sustained, can feelings expand and contact blossom in long-term relationships. So you can see, my friends, that relationships represent a tremendously important aspect of human growth. So he says the power and significance of relationships often pose severe problems for those who are still in the throes of their own inner conflicts. And then the unfulfilled longing becomes unbearably painful when isolation is chosen due to the difficulty of contact. This can be resolved only when you seriously settle down to seek the cause for this conflict within yourself without using the defense of annihilating guilt and self-blame, which of course eliminates any possibility of really getting at the core of the conflict. So, and I don't know if he's saying this exactly here, but what it's reminding me of is oftentimes, where, we have this sense of, inner not good enough or guilt or, shame, or, we have an idealized image and we fall short of it. And so, we, kind of feel small inside, and then feel like we can't connect as equals, we can't really relate to other people, in a adult way. We feel less than somehow, and that often creates problems in relationships, or we can want to feel more than, right, and special, and we require the specialness, and then that also usually doesn't work so well. So the search, together with the inner willingness to change, must be cultivated in order to escape the painful dilemma which both available alternatives, isolation and contact, which make them both unbearable. Fear of pleasure is to a large degree connected with the problem of dealing with others and of facing up to one's own blindness about the self. It is also important to remember that withdrawal can be very subtle and may be outwardly unnoticeable, manifesting only in certain guardedness and distorted self-protection. I often, kind of notice in my own self, right? Like I have a openness and a place that feels, like real, and then, and at times, like I feel like, wow, if I was fully sensitized and fully present to the beauty of this moment, it would almost be unbearable, or it would be like a mystical experience. So, even though I know that there's, a lot of contact and a lot of connection there, I can feel some barrier, some still, safety mechanism or disconnect. And, sometimes I think it's just because, it's like, to live in a mystical state all the time, is like kind of the alternative in some sense, and maybe we should try that sometime. But when we really realize the preciousness and the intensity and the amazing thing of what each of us are, and our capacity for seeing beauty and loving each other, and all of this, it's kind of how much we do give, even when we have conflict and we struggle, how much we work, how difficult life is. I think that's one of the things that I can't remember where I ran into it recently, but it just felt like sort of such a deep key to me to sort of being less hard on ourselves and having a better internal relationship with ourselves. And that is to really recognize, that life is just not a vacation. It is an initiation. It calls forth everything. It asks everything. It shakes everything. It challenges everything in us, right? And we can numb out to a certain degree, right? But even then we don't escape that undergoing. And so to kind of just realize that we are sensitive, that we are small in the face of an immensity that we don't fully understand, and that our flesh hurts, and as well as has, so all of this thing, we can have a great deal of compassion and appreciation for what we are undertaking in this incarnational experience. And we can really feel compassion and love for this human creature that we are, that we took on, the spirit is incarnate in. So when people whose spiritual development is on different levels are involved with one another, it is always the more highly developed person who is responsible for the relationship. Specifically, that person is responsible for searching the depths of the interaction which creates any friction and disharmony between the parties. Does that make sense to people? Says the less developed person is not as capable of such a search, right? Maybe still being in a state of blaming the other and depending on the other's doing right in order to avoid unpleasantness or friction. And also the less developed person is always caught up in the fundamental error of duality. So, it's kind of like he's saying, whoever can kind of have enough presence to, get out of, this limited dualistic kind of approach to things, please do so. That's what God is asking. And oftentimes even, the most highly evolved of the group, is still challenged or caught in these things. And yet we can begin to see and wake up inside of it, right? And try different things and see that we get a different response. And so I know, where I could, in my own path work, just, let, like learn and have my connections and do that. And, when I first had relationships, when I was younger, I thought, well, like you have to be best friends and tell everybody everything, and everything you do. And then, when I got married, he's a good guy, but he wasn't like so much into all of this stuff. And, so sometimes I still talk to him and tell him about it. I don't feel like I'm inhibited, but it felt like I let go of sort of, some kind of demand, that we have to be meeting at that level and just receive the way that he could love me. Right. And that seemed to have, opened up, in him, also a great giving forthness, right? Because I think sometimes in our world, men have trouble knowing how to give to women, right? Because women can, always be sort of demanding, or, maybe we're also submissive too, but, it's like there's a kind of, sense, I think, that for both men and women, we just need to be able to give our love the way we know how to give it. And if we can, receive another person's love just the way that they can give it without needing to change them, without, needing to correct or get a different kind of love from them, then I think we can be in a good intimate relationship. And, he talks a little bit later on about how, that one-on-one intimate relationship is such an important one. So the spiritually more developed person is capable of realistic, non-dualistic perception. That person may see that either one of you may have a deep problem, but that does not eliminate the importance of the possibly much lesser problem of the other one. So, we can see that there's a both and, right? But the more developed one will always be willing and able to search for his or her own involvement whenever he or she is negatively affected, no matter how blatantly at fault the other one may be. Right? Does that make sense? And is that easy? How easy is that for you to do? Or do you get caught in trying to make the other fault the main issue?
Often.
Yeah, it's tough to do, especially when you're triggered. It's really hard to take a step back, right? It's part of the training. I'm not getting good at it.
Yeah. And then, and so part of it is then just looking at, well, so what are the triggers? What are because it's not everything that will take you, into that. And so then we can use sort of like the deeper understanding of what the temptations are for us, right? That take us into that place of, wanting to make the other one, the guilty party, the wrong one, the fault. He says the tendency to make yourself emotionally dependent on others, the overcoming of which is such an important aspect of the growth process, largely comes from wanting to absolve yourself from blame or extract yourself from difficulty when establishing and maintaining a relationship.
I highlighted that because that totally resonates with my behavior.
So can you say some more on it? No?
Yeah, no. So one of my major images is this idea that I have to be submissive, I have to give it all away. And so by doing that, I know that I give away my authority. And it's like a real negative pleasure in saying, okay, you take care of me. I'll let you do whatever you want to me, but then I'll blame you for doing it later, right? It's
right. And I'm not responsible, right? Yeah.
Right, yeah. And boy, are you bad for being mean to little old me. Yeah. Really terrible. It's nice to see, but it's terrible.
Yeah. And to recognize, whether, maybe terrible. This is sort of the study of, well, how terrible all are our faults, right? And so, from the child's place, they're just ignorance, they're confusion.
Right. And she didn't have a choice when she was little.
Yeah.
So, now that it's nice to see that there's another option.
Right.
What are the options? I don't have to jump into this reactivity and always be the same person in every single relationship. I can choose. It's liberating.
Right. Exactly. So, yeah. And so then, it's like he says, it's only when we begin truly to assume the self-responsibility by looking at our own problem in the relationship, and by a willingness to change, that the freedom is established, and then relationships become more fruitful and joyous. So if the highly developed person refuses to undertake the appropriate spiritual duty to assume responsibility for the relationship and look for the core of dissension within, he or she will never really understand the mutual interaction, how one problem affects the other. And I know, there are people that they're constantly fighting and bickering and, triggering each other. And you know, it's like blaming and it's, you know, it's like it's a very volatile and, you know, like somehow they like to stay in it, you know, but these things can be, you know, a struggle, you know, and yet the guide says even that is better than being isolated, right? You know, like, okay, get in there and duke it out, right?
Really? Is that true?
Yeah, yeah. In some ways, you know, like, I mean, I'm not saying in, you know, like, eh, I think what he's saying
Believe
is,
that.
well, if you're avoiding, you know, some of the, uh, you know, like, you know, like, okay, I'm going to close my heart. I can't stand, you know, and so you're withdrawing, you know, it's like, it may be self-protective in some ways, but, you know, how much is really needed, right? So he's again saying, you know, periods of isolation of, you know, but if you are avoiding being triggered, right, in some way, then maybe, I mean, that's part of when we're, you know, dying into life, right? You know, like, well, is this something that I want to address before I die, right? You know, or do, you know, because, you know, it's,
Well, but two people who are constantly duking it out, so to speak, are not actually
no,
at the
no,
point of being aware that they're even being triggered.
no, I
They're
agree. I
just
agree.
duking it out and triggering each other because they know how to push each other's buttons.
Right. And this is right. And I'm not saying that you, Frank, you know, should devolve into that, you know, because you're not on that level, right? But if somebody was in that kind of a duking out thing and then decided, well, okay, you know, I'm going to go be isolated forevermore because all men are terrible and they're always going to be this way, you know, and then they just kind of gave up, then in their life journey, maybe, you know, the sort of the attempt to, you know, just back and forth between the two pseudo solutions of, you know, like struggling and duking it out or separating and being alone, you know, for that person to evolve unconsciously, the interaction is probably a better, you know, evolutionary tool than the withdrawal.
That's why we have couples counseling.
Right, yeah. And some people, you know, it's like that's just their level and how they, you know, will, you know, do this incarnation. It's not the end of the world for sure. Uh, Um, a lot of people live that out in various forms. So, but you know, for our work, definitely, you know, it's like we're hopefully more conscious than that. And so,
Well, I do think that the triggering, what Judy said, triggering into an image is like really big. I mean, let's say you have an image, an underlying image that you are, you know, you don't matter, or you're not being seen, you've never been seen or
right,
heard, or something like that.
exactly.
And the person that you happen to be in relationship with, even if they're not even if they're not a romantic partner, let's say it's a work relationship, and that person says to you, man, you don't get it. Well, hello, trigger. You know, it's like you're a dumbass and your opinion doesn't matter and you don't get it. And there you go.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, you know, it's kind of like it matters, I think, how we, you know, how we work with that, right?
Yeah.
You know, and I think most of us that have been doing this work for a while, like, you know, I mean, for me, it's the part, it is the spiritual discipline of the path work. If I get triggered, I go and do an inner meditation to access and understand and, you know, feel into and explore and all of that, right? So it's just kind of the natural, the inner trigger equals time for, you know, time to do some work, time to, you know, understand something. And I might not be able to do it right in the moment that I'm like totally activated and everything, but there's going to come a moment when I'm no longer, you know, like I wake up out of it, you know, and realize, oh, I just got triggered, you know, and that's the point in time when I can go and do that work. And so it's sort of like a commitment, right? Never to just let, you know, some disharmony, some challenging, you know, dynamic that gets activated inside of me go completely. You know, when a pain body comes up, then I want to spend some time. I don't, you know, always get to the bottom of every one of them every time, you know, but I want to spend some time exploring, you know, what just happened? Who was that in there? Yeah. So, I can't remember exactly where I am. On the other hand, if the spiritually developed person accepts this responsibility, he or she will help the other in a subtle way. If he or she can desist from the temptation to constantly belabor the obvious sour points of the other and look within, he or she will raise her own development considerably and spread peace and joy. The poison of the friction will soon be eliminated. It will also become possible to find other partners for a truly mutual growth process. When two equals relate, and this is where hopefully most of us are in, you know, relationship, you know, levels with, you know, equals in partnership, both carry the full responsibility for the relationship. This is indeed a beautiful venture, and this could be a friendship as well, you know, a deeply satisfying state of mutuality. The slightest flaw in a mood will be recognized for its inner meaning, and thus the growth process is kept up. Both will recognize their co-creation of this momentary flaw, whether it be an actual friction or a momentary deadness of feelings. The inner reality of the interaction will become increasingly more significant, and this will largely prevent injury to the relationship. Let me emphasize here that when I speak of being responsible for the less developed person, I do not mean that another human being can ever carry the burden for the actual difficulties of others. This can never be. What I mean is that difficulties of interaction in a relationship are usually not explored in depth by the individual whose spiritual development is more primitive. He or she will render others responsible for his or her unhappiness and disharmony in a given interaction, and is not able or willing to see the whole issue. Thus, that person is not in a position to eliminate the disharmony. Only those who assume responsibility for finding the inner disturbance and the mutual effect can do so. Hence, the spiritually more primitive person always depends on the spiritually more evolved one. A relationship between individuals in which the destructiveness of the less developed one makes growth, harmony, and good feelings impossible, or in which the contact is overwhelmingly negative, should be severed. You know, but otherwise, you know, it's like, you know, he's saying it's all good, you know, in some way if we can make use of it, and it depends on how we make use of it.
Darlene, I'd like to hang out with that for a little bit and kind of think that through, because what I'm hearing the guide is saying is that some friction, especially if both individuals are willing to take some responsibility and look at how they're contributing to the fire, is basically like needed and as part of being in relationships. But that if one person is more volatile and more blind in a way, and the other one isn't, then that relationship needs to be severed, which makes me try to picture it like in, you know, actual relationships. So that might look like is there, like, why would a more evolved or that much more evolved being be with somebody, like get into a relationship in the first place like that? And I don't know, I just have a lot of like questions come up because I'm trying to find it in like real life.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's talking about here, right? I mean, the way I interpret this is, you know, he is talking about a destructive relationship, you know, like battering somebody or emotionally abusive or something like that, right? And so no matter how evolved one is, you know, like loving the batterer is not going to, you know, sometimes you have to just say, look, I can't be in this relationship with you, right? So
Well,
that's what
I
I
mean,
think.
that's an easy one. That's an easy one, but I'm almost hearing it in more subtle. Like I'm not just hearing like physical violence. I'm hearing some kind of tumultuous, emotional stuff that's going on between the two people. Like,
I mean, I think a
but
lot of people,
obviously.
right. And I think a lot of people, you know, have, I think again, as long as there's, you know, growth and movement, right? You know, like a tumultuous emotional experience is actually, I think, again, better than a disconnected and separate relationship, right? So I don't know that he would say that that's necessarily destructive, except for maybe where, you know, he says contact is overwhelmingly negative, right? You know?
Jacob, I had I know this. When I read this, I'm like, yeah, I know that. I had a girlfriend of mine who was my oldest friend. Like I knew her from public school, and she's for sure one of my soul groups. Like we were super close for decades. And as I started seeing my submissive, yucky behavior, and she was a power mask. So, you know, that this is the dynamic between us. You know, she'd say, let's do this. And I'd be like, okay. And it worked. We had a great relationship. I love her. She's a beautiful girl. But as I started kind of coming out of that and watching my own reaction, I started trying to talk to her about, you know, I kind of feel like this is, you know, I want to change our relationship. And she wasn't interested. And it got to the point where it was pretty uncomfortable. I hope to reconnect with her again, but I got out of it because of overwhelmingly negative emotions. Does that help at all?
Yeah. And I
Yeah, I can
think,
understand that. Sure.
go ahead, Jacob, and see if you can, if, you know, if there's another attempt that you want to make at kind of helping us understand the question.
Yeah. I mean, the way that Judy was describing her contact with the other person, I can understand that. Yeah, I think the confusion sometimes for me is the idea that there's so much to learn from relationships, and there is no such thing as like, oh, all those toxic people making me blah 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 blah, right? It's our own triggers, it's our own
Right.
difficulty with them. But I guess if we were to wrongly assume like maybe this is an image that we need to stay in the relationship, right? Like above all else, we have to preserve the relationship. Then that's maybe where the guide is pointing to as well. That can be an image in itself. That the relationship needs to be maintained, even if it's really painful and just chaotic, and it just feels like you keep going in the same circles. And let's say the one person has a really deep drug addiction, right? And they're just all over the place, and maybe you need to distance because you being around them is not helping you or them, kind of thing. And it's not all about just sticking it through no matter what, kind of
Yeah.
to the simplified image.
Yeah. I mean, there most people that I do know that are in these very volatile, sort of unhappy, constantly triggered fight kinds of relationships with each other, like you point out, maybe, that it is overwhelmingly negative, and that, maybe they should stop trying to solve this problem, but usually they are really attached, right? And so this is, whether it's somebody that's even being, physically sometimes abused, right? It's like there's an addiction to that dynamic, unless there is somebody more conscious in some way enough, and so sometimes, you're just trying to wake up and realize, like, oh, this doesn't feel so good, and what maybe I do have the wherewithal within me to be without it, right? With whatever I think
Right.
I have in the relationship that I have to stick around for, right? So yeah. Um,
I get it. I think what I realize is sometimes I look at guides' teachings as this like super deep, like general rule to be applied to many situations. I forget how subtle it is about very specific situations that I can certainly picture it. I think sometimes I try to apply it to too many things, and I
mm,
can now see the examples that are pretty obvious. Like they're
right.
not rocket science. That some relationships you just need to step away from.
Yeah. Yeah. But in general, most of them, right? Even if we are, in somewhat like, he's saying overwhelming negative contact, right? It's like maybe different than overwhelmingly negative feelings. I mean, if there are feelings and we have the wherewithal within us to, process those feelings, maybe they are feelings from the pain body and the wound, right? And it's really an opportunity to feel and heal, right? But it is subtle to discern, and to again see the dynamic that is unfruitful and unhealthy, and have the person most spiritually evolved take that responsibility for the dynamic, right? And understand it enough to maybe try something different, right? Like, um, because what happens is, that the two defenses are bouncing off of each other, and so um, someone, can take a different approach if they're conscious enough and they've held their own pain, that is activated in that situation.
I also heard this as a sort of a way that the guide might be addressing, um, how could I put it? Masochism. It's like you should not believe that no matter how difficult the relationship is, that you should stay in it.
Yeah.
All right. It's like, this is not what I think you should do. And if you get to that point, then you should, take the steps to end the relationship. Because he says in the next line, he says, if he or she could not do that, this indicates some kind of unrecognized weakness and fear that needs to be faced.
Exactly.
The unrecognized weakness might be this masochism. It's like, okay, I think I'll just hang in here and get beat up no matter what.
As all I deserve, or fear,
Yeah.
like, some kind of, often I find it's the inner child somehow is identified with the suffering of the inner child of the partner.
Yeah.
And so they fear the abandonment that they would feel if they left, right? And yet they can't stand to be with the person because the person is not really very pleasant to be around or whatever. So there's often this kind of emotional, love in a sense, but it's the love of the child trying to protect, somebody else's inner child from pain in life. And that doesn't work, right? So, but yeah, there's a lot of ways that we enmesh and we get caught in relationship in unhealthy ways. And so I think that's what he's saying is like, yeah, if you're just kind of like recycling and it's not going anywhere, probably if you can, it's better to, try to sever this one. And yet he also says if you can understand what is going on in that one, that's going to help you from sort of recreating that in the next relationship, right?
Yeah, and the most obvious relationship dynamic that comes to mind would be the narcissist and the codependent.
Right.
Like that codependent's going to hang in there no matter what,
Yeah.
It seems.
Yeah.
I've seen it in real life.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's all this unconsciousness, right? That again, this is just, what we're all trying to do is like pull back far enough to kind of recognize what that is, instead of being lost in that story of the feeling and the apparent need, for that. So but it's like, again, it requires that place where we really like stop, like we recognize this is a dynamic, and its source is not really in with this particular couple or this particular relationship. Its source is in me and my childhood relationships, most likely, you know, in the early imprinting that happened there. And so if you can, you know, go in and again feel the feelings, right, you know, that you're defending against by trying to, you know, take care of the other person so that they'll take care of you, or whatever the dynamic is, that, you know, you can, you know, be free, right? It's that shaman's death. So he's saying, if the relationship is dissolved on the grounds that it's more destructive and pain producing than constructive and harmonious, it should be done when the inner problems and mutual interactions are fully recognized by the one who takes the initiative to dissolve an old tie. And, you know, I don't know if it's fully, but, you know, it's good to make some attempt at that, you know, and the more that you have, the more I think it does prevent you from forming a new relationship with similar underlying currents and interactions. It also means that the decision to sever the connection has been made because of growth, rather than as a result of spite, fear, or escape. To explore the underlying interaction and the various effects of a relationship where both people's difficulties are laid bare and accepted is by no means easy. But nothing can be more beautiful and rewarding. Anyone who comes into the state of enlightenment where this is possible will no longer fear any kind of interaction. Difficulties and fears arise to the exact degree that you still project onto others your own problems in relating, and still render others responsible for anything that goes against your liking. This can take many subtle forms. You may constantly concentrate on the faults of others because at first glance, such concentration appears justified to you. You may subtly overemphasize one side of an interaction or exclude another. Such distortions indicate projection and denial of self-responsibility for the difficulties in relating. This denial fosters dependency on the perfections of the other party, you know, which of course is not exactly a good thing to depend on, right? Ours or anybody else's perfectionism, which is in turn creating fear and hostility for feelings let down when the other does not measure up to the perfect standard. And that's what we're usually always, you know, in that forcing current, trying to make them, you know, be this perfect, so we don't have to feel this, you know, this let down feeling. And it's just a feeling, right? And to allow ourselves to just grieve, right? You know, again, I see it as in this category of grief that we just have so much trouble allowing ourselves to grieve. My dear friends, no matter what wrong the other person does, if you are disturbed, there must be something in you that you overlook. When I say disturbed, I mean this in a particular sense. I do not speak of clear-cut anger that expresses itself guiltlessly and does not leave a trace of inner confusion and pain. I mean the kind of disturbance that comes out of conflict and breeds further conflict. Even you, my friends.
I love that. Wait a minute.
Uh-huh.
I loved that. That was
Yeah.
great. That really sums up how often I feel in conflict, right? This inner disturbance, and it's like, oh, okay, I got to go look at that. And
Right.
perfect.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, it's like it may take some practice to find that clear cut, you know, expression of self assertion too, you know, in this dance, right? You know, but it is that's a good way of seeing the differences. And you can kind of feel sort of, it's like, to me, it's basically those disturbances come out of defenses, right? You're in a defense, your defense triggers the other person's defense, because often our defense is really an offense, right? You know, and so we're, you know, offending, you know, by defending, and then people are reacting back. And we may be not even, reacting to the same things that we think we are, like it's like what my defense is and what you experience coming from me can be two different things, but you're going to be reacting from your projection.
And this experience that the guy talks about is this clear-cut anger that expresses itself guiltlessly and does not leave a trace of inner confusion or pain. It's when I felt that for the first time that I'm like, oh, this is what it means to feel okay with everything. All the other times I'm in reaction.
Right.
But I had to have that experience first before I realized the
difference. To see the difference. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you can feel like, in the one there, the divine quality of truth is there, right? And that is the defense. There's no need for defense because truth is being spoken. And without defense, then we don't have any of the messiness. So
I think the motive behind it is different. Right? It's kind of like, I will speak the truth, or I will set a boundary. Or I'll reflect something, but the intention is not to hurt, but to sometimes maybe stop the lower part of the other, or set something straight, or to, I don't know, be heard or be seen, right? That kind of like it's an energized aggression. Right.
Yeah. I don't know. It's like it's just it is kind of interesting to kind of feel into, because I think for me it just always has this quality of innocence and truth. Right. It's like it's not judgment. It's not but it may be saying stop, or like a no, it may have a no, but it's not it's like a clean no, and it doesn't have any baggage with it. So, and again, the guide is saying, that we have this right to our no, right? Because it's part of our necessary free will, right? And it's kind of aligning with, it may not be ultimate truth, but it's our temporary truth of the moment. And I just need to say no in this moment, and it's not your fault or my fault, it just is, right? And maybe I have to say no with some anger too, that backs you off, or sets that boundary, some forcefulness, like you were saying. Okay, so a favorite tendency among people is to say, you are doing it to me. The game of making others guilty is so pervasive that it constantly passes unnoticed. One human being blames the other, one country blames the other, one group blames the other. And this is a constant process at humanity's present level of development, and is indeed one of the most harmful and illusory processes imaginable. So begin to question yourself and cease placing the guilt on others. One derives pleasure from doing this, although the pain that ensues and the insoluble conflicts that follow are infinitely proportionate to the puny momentary pleasure. So he says, how about the victim, right? How is that person to cope?
So he says victim in quotes. So what does it mean victim, right? I'm happy that we're going to talk about this.
Right. Okay, so let me back up a little bit. So he's saying, that we sort of derive pleasure, from placing guilt on others and blame and that kind of thing. And he says, but that causes more conflict and pain. And those who play this game truly harm themselves and others. So I strongly recommend that you begin to be aware of your blinded involvement in this guilt-shifting game. So how about the victim, right? How is that person to cope? Because sometimes, we really do feel like, we've taken a blow, or something happened that we weren't expecting, and it doesn't seem like it was our fault or whatever, So he says, as a victim, your first problem is that you are not even aware of what is happening. Most of the time, the victimization happens in a subtle, emotional, in an articulated fashion. So I'm not speaking, he's speaking of something different here than I thought. So hold on. First, probably.
Probably more about, say, a person's behavior towards you rather than what they say to you.
Okay.
So I'm the victim. I'm the victim of somebody else's behavior. Is that what he's saying? Or the person I'm blaming is the victim?
So I'm not, let's see. So how about the victim? How is that person to cope? So to me, when he says the victim there, and it's in quotes, I think it, it's like he's saying that there really is no victim, right? But but as the victim, we aren't really aware that we're being blamed. I don't know. I'm a little lost and confused on it.
Let's say that I start behaving a certain way towards you, but I don't actually tell you why I'm behaving this way towards you. This goes on for months and months and months, actually. And underneath this, you can sense it. It's like you can sense that there's some kind of hostile behavior coming your way, but it hasn't been defined completely because I haven't ever told you what it is that what
Right. You're feeling resentful for being victimized. Gotcha.
Yeah. In a way, I'm victimizing you without even saying, telling you why.
Right.
Like passive aggressive behavior kind of thing. Is that what you're, okay.
There you go.
Okay. Good context, Frank. Perfect.
Yeah. And so, and then, neither personality really knows the intricate levels of the actions, reactions, and interactions, right? Until the thread becomes so enmeshed that it seems impossible to disentangle. And, it's like you can feel that sometimes, like where you have all of these different, blaming things, you did this and then you did this. So the launching of blame spreads poise and fear and at least as much guilt as one tries to project. The recipients of this blame and guilt may react in different ways according to their own problems and unresolved conflicts. As long as the reaction is blind and the projection of guilt unconscious, the counter reaction must also be neurotic and destructive. Only conscious perception can prohibit this. So only then will you be able to refuse a burden that is being placed on you. That we can become aware of that, and sort of not react to it unconsciously. Only then can you articulate and pinpoint it. So in a relationship that is about to blossom, one must be on the lookout for this pitfall, which is all the more difficult to detect because guilt projection is so widespread. Also, the recipient should look for it in themselves as well as in the other. And I do not mean here a straightforward confrontation about something the other person did wrong. I mean the subtle blame for personal unhappiness. This is what must be challenged. The only way you can avoid becoming a victim of blame and guilt projection is to avoid projecting it yourself, right? To the degree you indulge yourself in this subtly negative attitude, and you may do it in a different way than the one who does it to you. You will be unaware of it being done to you and will therefore become victimized by it.
So, what would be a prime example of this? Let's say somebody goes silent on you, someone you've had a relationship with, someone you're in a relationship with.
Right.
Maybe you're not living with them yet, but all of a sudden they're not answering your calls. They're not answering your texts. They're acting like you don't exist. And so your reaction to that might be, well, you know what? If they're giving me the cold shoulder, they're going to get the same thing in return.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
right. And so, then, like again, the separation occurs, right? And so there's a way, he says, only to the degree that you undefensively explore and accept your own problematic reactions and distortions, negativities, and destructiveness can you diffuse someone else's guilt projection. Only then will you not be drawn into a maze of falseness and confusion, because you know the truth, right? You're sitting in your grounded reality, right? Like you may be feeling daggers from them, but inside that, you're not sending daggers, or you're not, engaged in this kind of game, right? And so that you can be clean in recognizing, oh, it's them, it's not me, right? I know what I'm responsible for.
You might be cleaning it for a while, but if you sit in it long enough, trust me, the waters will get cloudy.
Maybe. I mean, again, it depends on your consciousness, right? And maybe what you do once you realize it, because, at that point, if that dynamic is happening and you are clean, then you need to speak it or separate,
Right.
get out of the relationship, and not sit in it too long. So only then will you no longer confuse self-assertion with hostility, because that's the different, like you feel, their stuff and you react in your own stuff. And so then you hold back because you don't want to react with your hostility, right? And so then you don't have your self-assertion, right, because you're holding back against your own hostility. So you have to clean the hostility. You have to be able to just be speaking in the truth, right?
Well, sometimes speaking the truth requires more courage than you can muster at the moment.
Yeah.
So you're spinning in that place of like saying to yourself, well, you know what, I'm not going to react at all, because that would be the lower conscious thing to do. But I don't have enough strength to actually make the confrontation.
Right. So that's where I think you have to go do your work first and then come back with the confrontation.
Definitely.
And then sometimes you make an attempt anyway, and it goes all haywire, but that's okay too.
Because you're lacking articulation.
So how can you assert your rights and reach into the universe for fulfillment and pleasure? How can you love without fear, unless you approach relating to others the way I have outlined above? Unless by learning to do this, you purify yourself, there must always be a threat when it comes to intimacy. Loving, sharing, and profound and satisfying closeness to others could be a purely positive power without any threat if these snares were looked at, discovered, and dissolved. It is of utmost importance that you look for them in yourselves, my friends. The most challenging, beautiful, spiritually important, and growth-producing kind of relationship is the one between man and woman. The power that brings two people together in love and attraction, and the pleasure involved, are a small aspect of cosmic reality. Whenever a man and a woman stay together in a more enduring and committed relationship, maintaining and even increasing bliss depends entirely on how the two relate to one another. Are they aware of the direct relationship between enduring pleasure and inner growth? Do they use the inevitable difficulties in the relationship as yardsticks for their own inner difficulties? Do they communicate in the deepest, most truthful, self-revealing way, sharing their inner problems, helping each other rather than placing mutual guilt on each other and whitewashing themselves? The answers to these questions will determine whether the relationship falters, dissolves, stagnates, or blossoms. When you look at the world around you, you will undoubtedly see that very few human beings grow and reveal themselves in such an open way. Equally few realize that growing together and through each other determines the solidity of feelings of pleasure, of enduring love and respect. It is therefore not surprising that long-lasting relationships are almost invariably more or less dead in feelings. Difficulties that arise in a relationship are always signals for something unattended to. They are a loud message for those who can hear it. The sooner it is heeded, the more spiritual energy will be released so that the state of bliss can expand along with the inner being of both partners. So we're winding up here, I think. You guys good to go on a little further?
Yeah.
So every day and every hour, one's inner state and feelings are testimony to one's state of growth. To the degree that they are heated, the interaction, the feelings, the freedom of flow within and toward each other will blossom. The perfectly mature and spiritually valid relationship must always be deeply connected with personal growth. The moment a relationship is experienced as irrelevant to inner growth, left on its own as it were, it will falter. Relationships are not recognized as a mirror for inner growth, so they gradually wear out. Either overt friction and dissension or stagnation and boredom will wreck what was once so promising. And only when both grow to their ultimate inherent potential can the relationship become more and more dynamic and alive. This work has to be done individually and mutually. When relationship is approached in that way, it will be built on rock and not sand. No fear will ever find room under such circumstances. So, when you have a relationship where, both partners can, actively do the work and take self-responsibility, it can be, a very rich, process of self-understanding and growth on both parts. And then there's lots of levels in between, that are excellent relationships, right? But that sense of equality, I think, is important, and the willingness, right, to support the partner in their own, becoming, achieving their own most intimate aspirations, right? We want it for ourselves, but can we give it to them? And whenever there is friction or deadness, something must be stuck, something that ought to be seen. Some interaction between the two people remains unclear. If it is understood and brought out into the open, growth will proceed at maximum speed. And in the dimension of feeling, happiness, bliss, profound experience, and ecstasy will become forever deeper and more beautiful, and life will acquire more meaning. Conversely, fear of intimacy implies rigidity and the denial of one's own share in the relationship's difficulties. Anyone who ignores these principles or who pays only lip service to them is emotionally not ready to assume the responsibility for his or her inner suffering, either within a relationship or in its absence. This state also brings about fear of one's feelings. You are still at the primitive juncture where you shift guilt on others. Fear and uncertainty will make it impossible under such conditions to find bliss and closeness. Fearless closeness. So you see, my friends, it is one of the greatest importance to recognize that bliss and beauty, which are eternal spiritual realities, are available to all those who seek the key to the problems of human interaction, as well as to the loneliness within their own hearts. True growth is as much a spiritual reality as our profound fulfillment, vibrant aliveness, and blissful, joyful relating. And when you are inwardly ready to relate to another human being in such a fashion, you will find the appropriate partner with whom this manner of sharing is possible. It will no longer frighten you, will no longer beset you with conscious or unconscious fears when you use this all-important key. You cannot ever feel helpless or victimized when the significant transition has taken place in your life and you no longer render others responsible for what you experience or fail to experience. Thus, growth and fulfilled, beautiful living become one and the same. Okay. Any final comments?
Yeah, it almost sounds like the guide almost like promises that you will have a fulfilling relationship, but I'm wondering if there are people who reach that state but then do not still end up in a fulfilling relationship like that. It almost sounds like that is something that will happen if you get to that space inside, that it will be reflected outside of you with a similar.
I suppose that there might be somebody's soul journey, mission in this lifetime, for some reason to not. But he says pretty much, that this is the path within the path, and it's the healthy thing for all people, and we need to, work with relationship and keep, because there is such richness in that. It's like our true fulfillment, and everything. So, and I think it is true. Like when, he really says, right, that again, your experience of relationship, whatever that is in any given moment, right, is really determined by what you can tolerate in terms of intimacy. And so it's never like that the other partner is, not is the problem ultimately. Again, it's that really strong position of, you are creating your own reality. This is your own inner landscape that is being projected out and then reflected back to you. So, it's like, if you can trust, if you can open your heart, if you can, no longer defend the little child in you, with these old patterns and defenses, like, yeah, I think he's promising that a beautiful relationship will be had. And it can be, like with your current partner, he's not saying, finally you'll find the real partner, it's like, it's already who you're with, most of the time. Every once in a while it's not, but most of the time it is. It's just that there's so much more that you could have with the current partner if you could open, and, they might too if you take the lead, right? Something like that. Does that help?
Yes, yeah, that does. Thank you.
I also wanted to point out to Judy that down here it says edited by Judith and John Saley.
Mhm.
Okay, now those two people we owe a great deal to. They really took the material that Eva delivered and made it a lot more comprehensible. That's my judgment of it all, because I've listened to a good number of Eva's actual recordings, and then when you read the lecture, yeah,
It takes it deeper, right? And I think some of them actually, after Eva recorded, she would take the she would also, like, the guide would add more material, is my understanding,
Is that
to
right?
the lectures. Yeah.
And
So
Judith Saley is 100 years old right now. Is that true?
yeah, I think so. I think she did recently have a birthday.
Yeah.
Well, now I'm really curious to go and hear the original lectures. I never even considered looking at them, but
Yeah,
Frank.
They cost $5 a piece on the Pathwork website.
Sounds good.
So just pick one that's really sounds really interesting to you. And
yeah.
And you can compare, the lecture then, and there's several different, there's the edited and the unedited, lectures. And then even in the unedited lectures, it's not word for word, because this is where I understood that Eva, like after she delivered the lecture, then she also added material to the lecture before it got distributed. So even before the editing that Judith and John did, Eva did some as well.
yeah.
So, yeah.
Directed
really
by
is.
the guide, you
Yeah, that was my sense, was that like the new, like, or maybe her sense of, the download that she got when she was delivering it, like filled in some more pieces or something.
Okay. Great.
It really is an enormous amount of work and diligence that went into putting this body of 258 written lectures together. I believe that Judith and John probably just spent, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of hours. I don't know, a lifetime. They had to have devoted most of their life to doing that, I would think.
I haven't heard much in the stories of all of that exactly. So, Donovan knew them both pretty well, and Susan. So sometime we'll have to ask them.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and it might be, I mean, I was thinking, like this lecture, I mean, it has some clarity to me, but it also has some things that aren't. And sometimes the way that Gary has gone through and, done his devotional lectures, and he will kind of put in parentheses his reference to what he thinks the sentence is referring to, because often, what the noun is, or, it's a little bit obscure or something. And so I don't know if he's always got exactly the correct, but, it helps to, look at the lectures, I think, from that perspective too. So, like lots of good, work that keeps pouring out of these. And so I think next week let's see, what was it, Judy, that I said? Do you remember? I can't remember right now.
I think it was only this one lecture that you sent
I
for
mentioned
us. Yeah.
I thought there was one more. Oh well, I'll remember it later too. I think but anyway, so we'll do it again in 2 weeks.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Dorothy.
everybody. Yep.
Yeah, that was
Thank
really
you.
helpful.
All right. Thanks, Darlene.
Bye.
Night,
Take care.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.